Racist firefighters refused to put out Oprah Winfrey's home during a fire in Los Angeles, but her response shocked everyone. Subscribe and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. The heat hung heavy in the air, a suffocating blanket that seemed to press down on Los Angeles without mercy. It was an oppressive summer, even by California standards, and the news channels buzzed with warnings of another devastating wildfire season. The dry winds, sharp and relentless, whipped through the canyons and hills, carrying with them the ominous scent of smoke. For weeks, firefighters had been battling smaller blazes across the region, but now a larger, more aggressive fire had emerged, threatening some of the most affluent neighborhoods in the city. Bel Air was one of those neighborhoods. Known for its sprawling mansions and carefully manicured gardens, it was home to some of the wealthiest individuals in the world. Yet, despite the ostentatious displays of wealth, the area was far from immune to nature's fury. The lush greenery that surrounded the estates, cultivated over decades, now served as kindling for the encroaching flames. Oprah Winfrey's home was nestled within this volatile landscape. Her estate, a symbol of her decades of success and philanthropy, sprawled across several acres. The house itself was a masterpiece of architecture, a blend of classical design and modern luxury. Tall marble columns framed the grand entrance, and wide terraces offered sweeping views of the city below. Gardens filled with vibrant flowers and rare plants surrounded the property, while a stable housed a handful of horses Oprah had rescued over the years. Inside, the atmosphere was tense. Oprah stood in her spacious living room, her arms crossed tightly over her chest as she stared out the floor-to-ceiling windows. In the distance, the orange glow of the fire was unmistakable. The television in the corner of the room droned on with updates about the fire's progression, but Oprah barely listened. Her mind raced with questions. Should she leave? Could she leave? What about the animals, her staff, the irreplaceable artifacts and memories housed within these walls? "Ma'am," said one of her assistants, breaking her train of thought. "The authorities have issued a mandatory evacuation for this area. We need to go." Oprah turned to face her, her expression calm but resolute. "I know," she said, her voice steady, "but I can't just leave. There's too much here, too many lives at stake." Her assistant hesitated, glancing nervously at the other staff members who had gathered in the room. Some of them looked ready to bolt for the door, while others seemed torn, unsure whether to stay or follow their employer's lead. "The fire is moving fast," the assistant continued, her voice laced with urgency. "They're saying it could reach this area by nightfall." Oprah nodded, her gaze returning to the windows. The sky outside was hazy, a sickly mix of gray and orange. She could see leaves and ash swirling in the wind, and the faint sound of sirens in the distance added to the growing sense of unease. "I understand the risks," Oprah said finally, turning back to address the room. "And I won't ask any of you to stay if you don't feel safe. But I'm not leaving. There are animals here that need to be evacuated, and I won't abandon them. If anyone wants to go, you have my blessing." A murmur rippled through the group. Some staff members exchanged glances, clearly grappling with their options. A few quietly excused themselves, heading upstairs to pack their belongings. Others, including Oprah's longtime personal assistant and a handful of groundskeepers, remained. Their loyalty was evident in their determined expressions. By late afternoon, the situation outside had worsened. The wind had picked up, sending more ash and debris into the air. The fire, visible now from the edge of the property, seemed to pulse with a life of its own, its flames licking hungrily at the horizon. Oprah had spent the past few hours coordinating with her team, making arrangements to transport the horses and other animals to a safer location. Trucks had been dispatched, but their arrival was delayed by the chaotic traffic clogging the evacuation routes. As the sun began to dip lower in the sky, painting the smoky air with hues of red and gold, Oprah stepped out onto the front terrace. The heat was palpable, a searing wave that made her skin prickle. She took a deep breath, inhaling the acrid scent of smoke, and surveyed the scene before her. The world felt smaller, more fragile, as if the fire's presence had shrunken it to this one precarious moment. "Ma'am, you should come inside," her assistant called from the doorway. "It's not safe out here." Oprah turned her head slightly, acknowledging the concern, but she didn't move. Her mind was made up. She would stay no matter what. The fire was a force of nature, unstoppable in its wrath, but she refused to be consumed by fear. There was too much at stake, and Oprah Winfrey had never been one to back down from a challenge. As she stood there, the distant wail of sirens grew louder. Help was on its way, or so she thought. The sound of sirens cut through the smoky air, a high-pitched wail that momentarily pierced the oppressive silence settling over Oprah's estate. For a brief moment, a sense of relief washed over her. Help had arrived. She turned to her assistant, who stood anxiously at the edge of the terrace, gripping a walkie-talkie like it was a lifeline. "They're here," Oprah said, more to herself than anyone else. From the driveway, the roar of engines grew louder, and moments later 4 fire trucks emerged through the haze, their red exteriors dulled by a layer of ash that coated everything. The vehicles slowed as they approached the front gates, their massive tires crunching over the gravel. Oprah's security staff had already opened the gates to grant them entry, and soon the trucks pulled to a stop near the main house. The firefighters disembarked with an air of deliberate slowness. They were a mix of older men and younger recruits, all clad in heavy gear streaked with soot. Oprah noticed immediately that they didn't seem rushed. There was no urgency in their movements, no sense of the life-threatening danger that surrounded them. The man who appeared to be their leader stepped forward, pulling off his helmet to reveal a weathered face and piercing blue eyes. His name tag read Captain Morris, and he carried himself with the casual authority of someone used to being in charge. "Miss Winfrey," he said, his tone flat and professional, though there was a subtle edge to his voice that Oprah couldn't quite place. "We're here to assess the situation." Oprah nodded, stepping down from the terrace to meet him. "Thank you for coming," she said, her voice calm but firm. "The fire is closing in fast. We've got animals on the property that need to be evacuated, and the house is at serious risk. I assume your team can start dousing the perimeter." Captain Morris didn't respond immediately. He glanced over his shoulder at his crew, who stood clustered near the trucks, some of them exchanging low murmurs. Then he turned back to Oprah, his expression unreadable. "We'll need to evaluate the site first," he said finally. "Decide the best course of action." Oprah frowned. "The best course of action is to stop the fire before it reaches the house. The flames are less than a mile away." "I understand your concern," Morris replied, his tone clipped. "But we have protocols to follow. We'll need to determine if this property is a priority." "A priority?" Oprah echoed, her voice tinged with disbelief. "This is a home, Captain. There are lives here. People, animals. What more do you need to determine?" Morris's lips pressed into a thin line, and for a moment he didn't answer. One of the younger firefighters behind him snickered quietly, earning a sharp glance from another. Oprah caught the exchange, and unease began to creep into her chest. Something was off. The captain finally spoke. "We'll do what we can," he said, though his tone lacked conviction. "But resources are limited. We've got other calls to respond to." Oprah's frustration bubbled to the surface. "I understand that you're stretched thin," she said, keeping her voice steady. "But you're here now, and this fire isn't going to wait for anyone. Please, do your job." Morris's jaw tightened, but he nodded curtly. "We'll set up equipment and take a closer look," he said, motioning for his crew to move. As the firefighters began unloading hoses and other gear, Oprah stepped back, watching them with growing apprehension. Their movements were slow, almost lethargic, and she noticed that some of them seemed more interested in talking among themselves than in preparing to fight the fire. The younger firefighter who had laughed earlier leaned against one of the trucks, chewing gum and eyeing the property with a mixture of disdain and curiosity. "Nice place you've got here," he called out, his voice loud enough to carry. "Must cost a fortune." Oprah ignored him, turning instead to her assistant, who stood nearby with a worried expression. "Something's not right," Oprah said quietly. "They don't seem focused." Her assistant nodded. "I've noticed it too. Do you think we should call someone else?" "Who?" "They're the only ones here," Oprah replied, glancing back at the firefighters. "But I'm not convinced they're here to help." The team spent the next hour moving equipment into place, but it became increasingly clear that their efforts were half-hearted at best. Hoses were unrolled but left lying on the ground, unconnected to water sources. One firefighter climbed onto the roof of the main house, ostensibly to assess the risk, but he spent more time taking photos with his phone than inspecting the structure. Oprah's unease grew into outright anger. She approached Captain Morris, who was leaning against the hood of his truck, scribbling notes on a clipboard. "Captain, I need to understand what's happening here," she said, her tone sharp. "Your team has been here for over an hour, and I don't see any progress. The fire is getting closer, and we're running out of time." Morris looked up at her, his expression cold. "I told you, ma'am, we're assessing the situation." "You've assessed enough," Oprah snapped. "Do something. Start spraying water, clear the brush, anything." Morris straightened, setting down the clipboard. "With all due respect, Miss Winfrey, we don't take orders from you. We follow our own protocols." "And what exactly do those protocols involve?" she demanded. Morris's gaze hardened. "Prioritizing properties that are worth saving." The words hung in the air like a slap. Oprah stared at him, stunned. "Worth saving?" she repeated, her voice low with disbelief. "Are you suggesting my home isn't worth saving?" Morris didn't answer. Instead, he turned and walked away, leaving Oprah standing there, a storm of emotions churning inside her. As she watched him rejoin his crew, she realized with chilling clarity that this was no ordinary situation. These men weren't just neglecting their duties, they were making a deliberate choice to let her home burn. And she wasn't sure why. Not yet. The sun had begun to set, casting a blood-red hue across the smoky sky. The flames in the distance flickered like a living entity, growing stronger with every passing moment. Oprah stood on the terrace, her arms crossed tightly over her chest as she watched the firefighters below. They moved with deliberate slowness, their actions disjointed and unfocused. It was becoming painfully clear. These men were not here to help. Her assistant approached cautiously, holding a bottle of water. "You need to stay hydrated," she said softly, offering the bottle. Oprah took it but didn't drink. "They're stalling," she said, her voice clipped. "Something's wrong." The assistant hesitated before speaking. "I overheard one of them," she said, glancing nervously toward the crew. He was laughing about how people like us don't deserve homes like this. Oprah's stomach tightened. The comment confirmed what she had begun to suspect. This wasn't negligence, it was something far more insidious. She looked toward the group of firefighters, her gaze zeroing in on the man her assistant had described. He was tall and broad-shouldered, his soot-covered face partially obscured by his helmet. He was laughing again, this time with two of his colleagues, their conversation punctuated by gestures toward her property. Deciding she'd had enough, Oprah strode down the steps, her anger simmering just below the surface. The group of men fell silent as she approached, their smiles fading into expressions of mock politeness. "Is there something amusing about this situation?" Oprah asked, her voice steady but sharp. The tall firefighter smirked. "Not at all, ma'am," he said, the word dripping with sarcasm. "Just making the most of a tough day." Oprah didn't flinch. "A tough day for you? My home is at risk, my animals are at risk, and you're standing here joking." The man's smirk widened. "With all due respect, Miss Winfrey, there are plenty of homes at risk. We have to decide what's worth saving." There it was again. Worth saving. The words hit like a blow, their meaning unmistakable. Oprah's heart pounded in her chest, but she forced herself to stay calm. "And who decides that?" she asked, her voice icy. "You?" The man shrugged. "Sometimes it's obvious." The other firefighters exchanged glances, some looking uncomfortable, others amused. Oprah turned her gaze to Captain Morris, who was standing nearby, pretending to be engrossed in his clipboard. "Captain," she called out, her tone commanding. "A word." Morris looked up, his expression unreadable. He walked over slowly, as if he had all the time in the world. "Yes, Miss Winfrey?" "Your team seems to have forgotten why they're here," Oprah said, gesturing toward the group. "I suggest you remind them." Morris's eyes narrowed slightly. "My team knows exactly why they're here. We're assessing the situation and determining the best use of our resources." Oprah took a step closer, lowering her voice. "Don't insult my intelligence, Captain. I've seen how you're working, or not working. If there's something you need to say, say it." For a moment, he said nothing. Then, leaning in slightly, he spoke in a low, measured tone. "Not every house is a priority, Miss Winfrey. We have limited water, limited manpower. We have to make choices." Oprah felt a wave of cold fury wash over her. Choices based on what? The value of the property? The people who live there? Morris straightened, his expression hardening. "I don't have to explain myself to you." "No," Oprah said, her voice rising, "but you will explain yourself to the fire chief and to the media, if I have anything to say about it." The threat hung in the air, but Morris didn't seem fazed. He gave a tight-lipped smile. "Do what you need to do, ma'am. We'll do what we need to do." As he turned and walked away, Oprah stood frozen, her mind racing. She felt the weight of the moment pressing down on her. The fire wasn't just outside her gates, it was here, in the attitudes and actions of the very people who were supposed to help. The tension escalated further as the fire drew closer. Embers began to fall like fiery snowflakes, igniting patches of dry grass on the property. Oprah's team scrambled to put them out with buckets of water and fire extinguishers, while the firefighters watched from a distance, making no move to assist. One of the groundskeepers, a man named Raoul, rushed up to Oprah. "Miss Winfrey, we're running out of water from the tanks. If they don't start helping soon, we won't be able to hold it back." Oprah looked toward the firefighters again, her frustration boiling over. She marched back to Morris, who was now leaning against one of the trucks, talking quietly with another firefighter. "The fire is on my property, she said, her voice shaking with anger. "Are you going to do something, or are you just going to stand there?" Morris sighed heavily, as if she were asking him for an unreasonable favor. "We'll get to it," he said, his tone dismissive. "Get to it?" Oprah repeated, incredulous. "The fire is here. What exactly are you waiting for?" Another firefighter, younger and cockier, chimed in. "Maybe we're waiting to see how much you care about this place. Got any checks to write?" A ripple of laughter ran through the group. Oprah felt her hands curl into fists at her sides. This wasn't just incompetence. It was cruelty, plain and simple, and it was aimed directly at her. "I don't know what kind of game you're playing," she said, her voice low and steady, "but I promise you it won't end well for you." The young firefighter smirked. "Is that so? Well, I guess we'll see." Oprah turned on her heel and walked away, her mind racing with the implications of what she had just experienced. These men were not going to help her. If anything, they seemed intent on watching her fail. As the fire edged closer, she realized that she and her team were on their own. Back at the terrace, her assistant and the remaining staff looked to her for direction. The fear in their eyes mirrored the dread she felt in her chest, but she forced herself to stand tall. "We're not going to let this place burn," she said firmly. "If they won't help, we'll do it ourselves." Her words sparked a new sense of urgency among the group. Buckets were filled, hoses were dragged to the property's edges, and the staff worked tirelessly to create a fire break. Oprah joined them, her determination overriding her exhaustion. But as she glanced toward the firefighters, who were now lounging near their trucks, she couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning of a much larger fight. The flames outside were dangerous, but the hatred within was even more insidious. The wind picked up, sending a wave of embers cascading over the property like a fiery storm. Oprah stood on the terrace, her jaw clenched as she watched her staff scramble to contain the small fires that were starting to ignite in the dry grass. The firefighters, meanwhile, remained by their trucks, making no effort to assist. Their indifference was infuriating, but there was no time to dwell on it. The flames were closing in. "Focus on the edges," Oprah called out to her team, her voice carrying over the chaos. "Keep the fire away from the main house." Her assistant, drenched in sweat, ran up to her, clutching a radio. "The trucks we called for the animals are still stuck in traffic," she said breathlessly. "What do we do if they don't make it?" Oprah glanced toward the stables where the horses were becoming increasingly agitated. Their loud whinnies echoed across the property, mingling with the crackling of the approaching fire. She felt a pang of helplessness but quickly pushed it aside. "We'll get them out no matter what," she said firmly, "even if we have to lead them out on foot." The assistant nodded and ran off to relay the message to the stable hands. Oprah turned her attention back to the fire, which now loomed ominously close to the property line. The heat was intense, and the air was thick with smoke, making it difficult to breathe. Near the edge of the estate, Raoul and two other groundskeepers were using a garden hose and shovels to fight back the flames. Oprah could see the desperation in their movements. They were outmatched, but they refused to give up. "Raoul," Oprah shouted, running toward them, "what do you need?" Raoul looked up, his face streaked with sweat and soot. "Water, we're almost out." Oprah turned toward the firefighters who were still standing idly by their trucks. She marched over, her anger reaching a boiling point. "Captain Morris," she yelled, "we need water now. My staff can't hold this back without your help." Morris looked up from where he was leaning against the truck, his expression bored. Like I said, ma'am, we have to prioritize our resources. Oprah's voice shook with rage. The fire is on my property. What other priority could there possibly be? One of the younger firefighters, the same one who had taunted her earlier, chuckled. Maybe we're just waiting to see how bad it gets. The others laughed, their cruelty cutting through the already tense atmosphere like a knife. Oprah stared at them, a mix of disbelief and fury flashing in her eyes. You're supposed to protect people, she said, her voice low but filled with intensity. That's your job. Morris shrugged. We do our jobs how we see fit. Before Oprah could respond, a loud crack echoed through the air. She turned just in time to see a tree on the property's edge go up in flames. The fire was spreading faster now, consuming everything in its path. Oprah knew they were running out of time. Fine, she said through gritted teeth. If you won't help, stay out of our way. She turned and ran back toward the house, where her team was doing everything they could to hold the line. Buckets of water were being passed in a frantic chain, and towels soaked in water were being used to smother small fires. The heat was unbearable, but no one stopped. We need to move the horses, Oprah shouted as she approached the stables. The animals were panicked, their eyes wide with fear as they stomped and whinnied. Two stable hands were trying to calm them, but it was clear the situation was becoming dangerous. Get them out, one by one, if you have to, Oprah said. Take them down the east path. It's the safest route. The stable hands nodded and began leading the horses out of the stables, their movements quick but careful. Oprah stayed to help, grabbing a lead rope and guiding one of the horses herself. The animal was skittish, pulling against the rope, but she kept her grip firm, murmuring soothing words. As they moved toward the east path, Oprah glanced back at the house. The flames were now dangerously close, and the heat was almost unbearable. Her team was doing everything they could, but without the firefighters' help, the odds were against them. Suddenly, a shout rang out. The roof! The roof is on fire! Oprah turned to see Raoul pointing toward the main house. Sure enough, flames had begun to lick at the edges of the roof, fueled by the dry leaves and debris that had collected there. Panic surged through her, but she quickly pushed it aside. Get the hoses on the roof, she called out. Now! Raoul and another staff member grabbed the nearest hose and began spraying water onto the roof, but the pressure was weak. The water barely reached the flames, which were spreading rapidly. We need more water, Raoul shouted. Oprah looked around, her mind racing. The property's water tanks were nearly empty, and the hoses connected to them were losing pressure. She knew there was only one option left. She turned toward the firefighters, who were still watching from a distance. You want to see how bad it gets? She yelled, her voice cutting through the roar of the flames. Look around. This is as bad as it gets. Either help us or get the hell out of here. For a moment, the firefighters said nothing. Then, one of them, a middle-aged man who had remained silent until now, stepped forward. He looked at Morris, his expression conflicted. Captain, he said quietly, we can't just stand here. Morris shot him a warning glance. We're following protocol. The man hesitated, then took a step back. Oprah felt a surge of despair. It was clear they wouldn't budge. Turning back to her team, she shouted, Keep going! Don't stop! The hours dragged on, the fire's relentless advance taking its toll. Oprah and her team worked tirelessly, but exhaustion was setting in. The house was now partially engulfed, and the stables were surrounded by smoke. Despite their best efforts, it was clear they couldn't save everything. As the fire continued its assault, Oprah couldn't help but glance back at the firefighters one last time. They were still there, standing by their trucks watching as her world burned. And in that moment, she realized the truth. This wasn't just a fire. It was a battle against hatred, indifference, and a deeply rooted system that saw her and her home as unworthy. But she wouldn't give up. Not now. Not ever. By the time the fire had fully consumed the western edge of the estate, the once pristine grounds were a smoldering wasteland. Trees that had stood tall and proud for decades were reduced to skeletal remains, their branches crackling under the relentless heat. The air was thick with smoke and the acrid stench of burning wood, making it nearly impossible to breathe without coughing. Oprah's team, drenched in sweat and covered in soot, moved like ghosts through the haze, their movements sluggish with exhaustion. Despite their best efforts, the flames had won. From the terrace, Oprah stood motionless, her gaze fixed on the blackened remains of her once beautiful library wing. The fire had swept through it mercilessly, devouring the rare books, artifacts, and personal treasures she had collected over a lifetime. She felt a deep, hollow ache in her chest, but there was no time to mourn. Not yet. Behind her, Raoul approached, his face streaked with ash. "Miss Winfrey," he said hoarsely, his voice barely audible over the distant crackle of flames. "We've done all we can, but the water's gone. We can't hold it back anymore." Oprah turned to face him, her expression a mixture of exhaustion and determination. "Are the animals safe?" she asked. Raoul nodded. "We got the horses out and down the east path. The trucks finally arrived and they're loading them up now." A small wave of relief washed over her. At least some lives had been spared, but her relief was short-lived as another loud crack echoed through the air. She turned just in time to see part of the roof of the main house collapse inward, sending a shower of sparks skyward. The sight was devastating, but Oprah refused to let it break her. She clenched her fist, drawing on the inner strength that had carried her through so many challenges in her life. "We need to evacuate the rest of the team," she said. "It's not safe here anymore." Raoul hesitated. "What about you?" he asked. "You should leave too." "I'll leave when everyone else is safe," she replied firmly. Together, they began coordinating the evacuation, guiding the remaining staff toward the vehicles parked near the gates. Oprah moved through the chaos with a calm authority, reassuring those who were on the verge of panic and encouraging those who were faltering. Despite the destruction surrounding them, her presence was a steadying force. As the last of the staff members climbed into the trucks, Oprah took one final look at the house. The flames had claimed much of it, but parts of the structure still stood, defiant against the fire's onslaught. She felt a surge of pride for what the house represented, not just her success, but the countless lives she had touched through her work and philanthropy. It was more than just a building. It was a symbol of resilience, and she wasn't going to let it be reduced to ash without a fight. "Miss Winfrey," a voice called out, snapping her out of her thoughts. She turned to see her assistant running toward her, her face pale. "The firefighters, they're leaving." Oprah's eyes narrowed. She followed her assistant's gaze toward the driveway, where the fire trucks were starting their engines. The firefighters were packing up their equipment hastily thrown into the back of their vehicles. Captain Morris stood by one of the trucks speaking into a radio. He glanced in Oprah's direction but didn't approach. Fury surged through her. She stormed over to him, her voice cutting through the noise. "You're leaving?" she demanded. "After everything, you're just going to abandon us?" Morris didn't flinch. "We've done all we can here," he said flatly. "There are other properties that need our attention." "All you've done is stand around and watch," Oprah shot back. "You haven't lifted a finger to help us." Morris's expression hardened. "It's not my job to explain our decisions to you, ma'am." Oprah's hands curled into fists. "This isn't about resources or priorities, is it? This is about me, about who I am and what I represent." Morris didn't respond. Instead, he signaled to his crew to move out. The trucks rumbled to life, their engines drowning out any further argument. Oprah stepped back, her chest heaving with anger and frustration as the vehicles disappeared down the driveway, leaving her and her team to fend for themselves. The fire continued to rage well into the night, but with no water left and no professional help, there was little anyone could do. By dawn, the flames had finally begun to die down, leaving behind a charred and smoking landscape. The once grand estate was unrecognizable, and its beauty reduced to blackened ruins. The main house still stood, but it was heavily damaged, its roof partially caved in and its walls scorched. The stables were gone, as were several smaller outbuildings. As the first rays of sunlight broke through the smoke-filled sky, Oprah stood on what remained of the terrace surveying the destruction. Her assistant approached cautiously, a clipboard in hand. "Ma'am," she said softly, "we've accounted for everyone. No one was hurt." Oprah nodded, her gaze still fixed on the ruins. "That's what matters most," she said quietly, but the words felt hollow. She had saved lives, yes, but the loss of her home and everything it represented was a heavy blow. In the days that followed, investigators arrived to assess the damage and determine the cause of the fire's rapid spread. Oprah cooperated fully, providing access to the property and answering their questions. But she couldn't shake the feeling that the firefighters' actions, or lack thereof, had made the situation far worse than it needed to be. Word of the fire began to spread, and soon the media caught wind of what had happened. Oprah's name was already synonymous with resilience and perseverance, but this story was different. It wasn't just about a house burning down. It was about something much deeper, something far more sinister. As Oprah stood amid the ruins of her home, she made a silent vow. This wasn't the end of the story. The fire may have taken her house, but it hadn't taken her voice, and she intended to use it to ensure that no one else would have to face what she had endured. The morning after the fire was a quiet symphony of destruction. Smoke still curled from the charred remains of trees, and the once pristine grounds were now an ashen wasteland. Oprah stood at the edge of the terrace, the scorched marble beneath her feet a sharp contrast to the elegance it once held. Her mind replayed the events of the previous night. Every moment of struggle, every spark that claimed another piece of her home, and every mocking glance from the firefighters who had abandoned her. It wasn't just the house that was gone. It was a sanctuary, a symbol of the life she had built through resilience and hard work. But as she stood there, breathing in the acrid air and surveying the damage, she felt something stronger than despair: determination. Her assistant approached cautiously, a tablet in hand. "Ma'am," she said softly, "there's already media coverage about the fire. They're asking for a statement." Oprah turned to her, her expression unreadable. "What are they saying?" The assistant hesitated. "They're focusing on the destruction, but there's already speculation about why the firefighters didn't intervene." Oprah felt a flicker of validation. People were noticing. But this wasn't just about her. It was about something far larger, something systemic. She had spent decades fighting for equality and justice, and now this fire had exposed yet another layer of inequity. "Prepare a press release," she said finally, "but keep it brief. I'll address it myself when the time is right." The assistant nodded and stepped away, leaving Oprah alone with her thoughts. She took a deep breath, her gaze lingering on the blackened shell of her home. She had always believed in the power of action, and now was no different. It was time to act. In the following days, Oprah's focus shifted from the ruins of her estate to uncovering the truth about the firefighters who had failed her. She began by reaching out to local authorities, demanding an explanation for their inaction. What she received in return was a carefully worded statement that reeked of evasion. The firefighters assigned to your property were following standard protocols. The statement read, "In situations of high demand, resources must be allocated to areas of greatest need." Oprah knew this was a lie. She had seen their faces, heard their words. This wasn't about resources. It was about bias, about the choices they had made to prioritize some lives over others. And she wasn't going to let it slide. Her next step was to gather evidence. She called upon her network of friends, colleagues, and legal experts, enlisting their help in piecing together what had happened. She learned that the volunteer fire crew assigned to her property had a history of complaints, many of which had been quietly dismissed. Some of the firefighters were even rumored to have ties to extremist groups, though these claims had never been formally investigated. Oprah's team worked tirelessly, compiling a dossier of information that painted a damning picture of negligence and prejudice. The evidence was clear. This wasn't just a failure of duty. It was a deliberate act of discrimination. When the story broke, it spread like wildfire. Headlines screamed accusations of racism within the fire department, and the footage from that night, captured by Oprah's security cameras, only added fuel to the fire. The video showed the firefighters standing idly by as the flames consumed the property, some of them laughing and making dismissive gestures. It was impossible to deny. Public outrage was swift and unforgiving. Protests erupted outside the fire department's headquarters, demanding accountability and reform. Social media lit up with calls for justice, and celebrities and activists lent their voices to the cause. Oprah, however, remained silent, for the moment. Behind the scenes, she was working tirelessly. She had always believed in the power of turning pain into progress, and this was no exception. She used her resources to fund a full-scale investigation into the fire department, uncovering not just the failures of that night, but a pattern of systemic issues that had gone unchecked for years. When Oprah finally spoke publicly, her words carried the weight of her experience and her unwavering resolve. "I lost my home," she said during a televised interview, her voice steady but emotional. "But this isn't just about me. This is about a system that allows prejudice to determine who gets help and who doesn't. It's about ensuring that no one else has to stand and watch as their world burns, while the people sworn to protect them stand by and do nothing." Her speech resonated deeply, sparking a nationwide conversation about systemic bias in emergency services. Lawmakers began drafting legislation aimed at increasing oversight and accountability within fire departments. Funds were allocated for diversity training, and stricter hiring practices were implemented to prevent individuals with extremist ties from joining these critical services. Months passed, and Oprah's estate began to take shape again. The rebuilding process was slow and arduous, but it was also cathartic. She made the decision to incorporate elements that symbolized resilience and renewal. A garden filled with native plants that could withstand the heat. A library dedicated to preserving the stories of marginalized voices, and a memorial to the lives lost in the fire. But more than the physical reconstruction, Oprah focused on rebuilding trust. She met with local community leaders, firefighters, and activists, fostering dialogues about how to create a more equitable system. She funded scholarships for aspiring firefighters from underrepresented backgrounds and launched a foundation dedicated to addressing systemic racism in public services. On the day her home was officially completed, Oprah stood at the edge of her property, looking out at the horizon. The sun was setting, casting a warm golden light over the new structure. It was a moment of closure, but also a reminder of everything that had been lost. Her assistant approached, holding a tablet. "Ma'am," she said, "the press is asking if you have any final comments about the fire." Oprah thought for a moment before replying. "Tell them this. The fire showed us what needs to change, and now we're making those changes." As the sun dipped below the horizon, Oprah turned back toward her new home. The fire had taken much, but it had also revealed truths that needed to be confronted. And now she was ready to move forward, stronger, wiser, and more determined than ever. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe to stay updated with more content. Check out our other videos for stories that inspire thought and action. And if this one resonated with you, share it with someone who might appreciate it too. See you in the next video.